senseless act took her from
One of the most difficult experiences of my life because he didn't want to have a baby. And it's the most cowardly thing. Karli and her unborn child receives 2 life sentences without the...
On the night of September 12th into September 13th, 2021, in McKeesport, Pennsylvania, 26-year-old Karli Short, daughter of former NFL player Brandon Short, was shot to death right outside her own home. She was pregnant. Her killer was a man named Isaac Smith. He and Karli had been intimately involved, and he was convinced the child she was carrying was his. He was wrong. In this video, we're breaking down what pushed a man to that kind of desperation, and how cleverly he managed to fool the police along the way.
A man accused of killing a young woman and her unborn baby pleaded not guilty today.
Karli Asti Short was born July 18, 1995, in McKeesport, Pennsylvania. Her parents, Brandon Short and Krista Pettis, split up when she was very young, but according to Krista, she and her daughter grew up together in a way. Karli was her only child, and the two of them shared an especially close bond. Around that same time, her father was building a career as a professional football player. He played at his hometown, McKeesport Area High School, went on to become an All-American at Penn State, and was drafted by the New York Giants in 2000. He later played for the Carolina Panthers, spent 7 seasons in the NFL, earned an MBA from Columbia University, and moved into international finance.
For Karli Short's father, former Penn State and NFL football player Brandon Short, being here with family and friends was about getting...
He also joined Penn State's Board of Trustees, his alma mater. For a small industrial town like McKeesport, that kind of resume made Brandon Short a recognizable name well beyond the state line. Karli's childhood was packed. By age 4, she was already a cheerleader for the White Oak Falcons, an age when most kids aren't picking their own hobbies yet, and she was already performing in front of crowds. She played basketball through the McKeesport YMCA and was a majorette with the Golden Eagles of North Huntingdon. Every one of those activities has one thing in common: they put you in front of people. And based on how the rest of her life unfolded, that role seemed to come naturally to her. In high school, she studied cosmetology, and after graduating from McKeesport High School in 2014, that training became a side income. She worked as a hairstylist and makeup artist, helping people look their best for weddings, graduations, anniversaries, the big moments in their lives. Around the same time, she took a job with PC Planning and Catering, where, according to people close to her, her signature dish was mac and cheese, and she was considered a genuinely great cook.
All out just to make people smile, who loved cooking, who was excited to be a mother.
But the job Karli loved most, according to her family, was caregiving. She worked with elderly residents, first at Mount Vernon of South Park Nursing Home, then at Senior Care Plaza. Caregiving is daily physical and emotional labor. It takes patience and the ability to stay attentive to someone else's needs even when the work becomes routine. People who knew her, co-workers, relatives, people from her church, all described her the same way, independently of each other. Someone who was always trying to help others. She was a member of Bethlehem Baptist Church in McKeesport, and by all accounts, her faith wasn't just a formality. It was a real part of her life, and she was known within that community. The people who worked alongside her in nursing homes didn't remember her as someone who just ended up in that job. They remembered her as someone who chose it, deliberately, to take care of others. In a town where her father's name could have opened doors to a much more public kind of life, she spent her days quietly caring for elderly people that most others overlooked. That choice, arguably, says more about who she was than anything anyone who knew her could put into words. Karli didn't treat her pregnancy as a reason to slow down. She kept working, kept helping out at church, kept picking up makeup gigs on the side. Her Harry Potter-themed gender reveal party wasn't some last-minute idea. It was the product of real planning. She'd picked the theme in advance, worked out the details, and based on her messages, she was counting on the people who mattered most to her, and to her future child, to be there. By this point, Karli's father, Brandon Short, was married to Maureen. The couple had been living outside the US, in London, and returned to the States in July 2021, partly to be near Karli during her pregnancy. Brandon and Maureen also have 2 children together, Noah and Miriam, Karli's half-siblings. The family's return to the US meant that for the first time in a long while, father and daughter were living in the same city again. Right as Karli was preparing to become a mother herself, a family that had recently been scattered across continents was pulling back together, converging on McKeesport ahead of the birth just weeks before tragedy hit. Isaac Christopher Smith was born and raised in that same city, McKeesport. He'd been adopted. On the surface, he came across as a decent, upstanding young man with a solid reputation, especially in the eyes of his religious parents, who saw him as serious and responsible. Behind that image, investigators would later find, was something very different. Smith was seeing multiple women at the same time, and none of them knew the others existed. He had one steady girlfriend he kept things going with alongside everything else. And that relationship, it seems, mattered to him more than the rest. At least to everyone around him, it looked like the only official one. For someone raised in a religious household who clearly cared about his parents' approval, reputation wasn't some abstract idea. It defined his place in his own family. If that approval was less of a preference for Smith and more of a requirement, then the double life he was living wasn't a small deception. It was a debt that kept growing, one that would eventually have to be paid, either through confession or by eliminating whatever threatened to expose it. Karli and Isaac connected through social media roughly 2 years before her death. Smith himself, when he later spoke to investigators, described the relationship in strikingly minimal terms. He said they'd only been intimate 3 times, and that calling it a relationship would be a stretch. Karli saw it differently. When she found out she was pregnant, she was certain Smith was the father. He didn't walk away from that part of her life. Smith went with Karli to one of her prenatal appointments, a gesture that doesn't fit easily with the image of a man denying any involvement whatsoever. 2 days before her death, on September 11th, 2021, Karli texted him. She asked him for money and discussed plans for the gender reveal party. Smith was expected to attend that party, which meant he was set up to be publicly recognized as the father of her baby. At the same time, according to investigators, his relationship with his longtime girlfriend was heading toward a stage that made Karli's existence and her pregnancy an especially inconvenient thing to keep hidden. His girlfriend was preparing to meet, or had already met, his parents, people whose opinion of him clearly meant a great deal to Smith. It's worth pausing here to ask a question the story doesn't answer directly. How does a man running that many parallel relationships manage to show up for a prenatal appointment while keeping the woman he's seriously dating completely in the dark? One theory is that Karli simply had no idea how deep the deception ran and read his involvement as a sign that the future father was stepping up. She had no reason to think otherwise. A less flattering theory is that Smith was trying to keep everything under control right up until the end, betting he could keep both parts of his life running in parallel without letting them collide, and that showing up to the appointment was less about affection and more about managing risk. There's another angle to this story worth sitting with. Why, specifically in September 2021, did Smith's longtime girlfriend end up in a room with his parents for the first time? Is that a coincidence, or a sign that his relationship with her was moving into more serious territory at the exact moment Karli was preparing to announce to the world who her baby's father was? If it's the latter, then 2 separate storylines: Smith growing closer to his steady girlfriend and the approaching party where he was set to publicly appear as a future father, were converging with unsettling timing. It's also worth asking a question about Karli herself. She grew up in a family where her father's name opened doors, and yet she chose a life without much of the spotlight: caregiving work, helping elderly people, staying active in a small church community. Meanwhile, the man she believed was the father of her child never once introduced her to his parents, and apparently had no plans to bring her into the circle of people whose opinion he valued so much. Did that secrecy worry her? Or did she explain it away, telling herself he just had a complicated personality, that he wasn't ready to move fast, that things would settle once the baby arrived? The story doesn't preserve an answer to that, but the gap between Karli's openness and Smith's secrecy matters for understanding what was happening between them in the final weeks of her life. One thing is clear: the closer her due date got, the less room Smith had to maneuver. Karli wasn't hiding her pregnancy. She talked about it openly, with her family and with him. Sooner or later, it was going to reach the people whose opinion he guarded so closely. The question was never whether his parents and girlfriend would find out. It was when, and what he'd do once he felt like he couldn't control it anymore. On September 13th, 2021, that uncertainty was going to end, one way or another. Before we go further, if this case has your attention, hit that like button. It tells us these are the stories worth telling. Subscribe so you don't miss the next investigation, and drop a comment. What's your read on this case so far? Now, back to it. The night of September 12th into September 13th, 2021 started out like any other in McKeesport. Karli Short was staying at her uncle's house on 25th Street, the same house she lived in. There's no documented record of what she did that evening, who she talked to, or what was on her mind as she got ready for bed, 5 months pregnant. What is known starts around 12:20 a.m., and from that point forward, the timeline is documented down to the second. At roughly 12:20 a.m., Karli's cell phone rang. The call came from a burner phone, a device that investigators would later trace back to Isaac Smith. The call lasted 1 minute and 20 seconds. The signal placed that phone in the area near Karli's cousin's house, just a few minutes walk from where Karli was at that moment. The fact that a burner phone was used for that call is worth pausing on. A regular phone leaves a constant, easily traceable record with a carrier. A burner phone exists specifically so that record doesn't get created, so the call can't be tied back to someone through their everyday number. At 12:20 in the morning, someone called Karli using exactly that kind of device. Almost nothing is known about what was said during that call.
The same time, Short's uncle, Perry Reese, testified he heard the shot too.
The only fragment that survives is something Karli's uncle overheard from somewhere else in the house. He heard his niece ask someone on the phone, "Are you coming to the front or the back?" That question suggests the person on the other end was either already near the house or about to be within minutes. The tone of that question, what Karli was told in response, whether she felt any unease or simply the calm of expecting a familiar visitor, none of that was recorded, and it's unlikely any of it will ever be known. A late-night call followed by a question about which door to use is the kind of behavior pattern you'd expect from a relationship where visits like this had already happened before and didn't need explaining. The call ended, and 2 minutes later, at 12:22 a.m., the home surveillance system caught Karli walking out through the back door.
The image you are watching, prosecutors say, shows Karli Short walking out the back door of a McKeesport home at 12:22 a.m.
That door opened onto Furnace Alley, a narrow lane behind the house where the backyards of several neighboring properties met. Karli walked from the yard out toward that alley. By all appearances, she was heading to meet the person who just called her, the same person who'd been asked to choose between the front door and the back. She left alone, without waking anyone or telling anyone where she was going. Ordinary behavior, late at night, for someone who had no reason to expect danger from the meeting ahead of her. Exactly 1 minute after the camera caught her stepping outside, at 12:23 a.m., the shot spotter system activated. Its acoustic sensors detect gunfire in real time and relay the location directly to law enforcement. The system flagged a gunshot in the immediate vicinity of Karli's home.
Reese told the judge he yelled Karli's name 4 times, but wasn't able to walk to check on her. Police say Karli Short was shot in the head.
Karli Short was killed by a single gunshot to the head. Only a minute passed between the last moment the camera caught her alive, walking into the yard, and the moment the gunfire detection system triggered. In that 1 minute, she made it from the back door to wherever in the yard or alley the shot found her. A single shot to the head isn't a stray hit from a struggle or panicked firing in the dark. It's a shot that requires the shooter to be close enough and calm enough to aim. What happened during that 1 minute, whether there was a brief exchange of words between her and the shooter, whether she recognized the person approaching her in the dark, whether the attack happened instantly, without a word, none of that is known. There's no audio, no witness account of that specific window of time. The only thing that can be said with certainty is that no more than 3 minutes passed between the phone call and the gunshot picked up by the acoustic sensors. Not a single neighbor later reported hearing a scream, an argument, or any sound of a struggle before the shot. That night on 25th Street appears to have stayed quiet right up until the single gunshot that ended 2 lives at once, Karli's and the life of the child she was carrying. Karli's body lay in the yard until morning. It was found by a neighbor, someone going about an ordinary morning routine who had no idea what he was about to walk into. Several hours passed between the gunshot, logged at 12:23 a.m., and the moment her body was discovered in daylight. Hours during which, as far as anyone can tell, nobody walked down Furnace Alley, or if they did, nobody noticed a body lying in the shadow of the yard. That gap between the gunshot and the discovery of her body might be the hardest part of this whole story to sit with. For several hours, Karli and her unborn child stayed exactly where death had found them, while inside a house just a few feet away, an ordinary night's silence apparently continued undisturbed. Her uncle, who'd overheard her last conversation, went to sleep that night with no idea that her quick trip into the backyard would be her last. It's worth taking a moment on the shot spotter system itself. Those acoustic sensors are typically installed in parts of a city where gunfire happens more often than average, designed to alert police automatically in real time without needing a resident to call it in themselves. The fact that the system triggered in this particular part of McKeesport doesn't say anything unique about that specific night. It says that this stretch of the city was already considered troubled enough to have that kind of equipment installed in the first place. There's one more detail in this timeline that's easy to lose among everything else, but worth calling out on its own. Karli walked out to meet someone in the middle of the night, 5 months pregnant, in her own backyard, without, as far as anyone can tell, any concern for her own safety. Everything about her behavior, the casual way she asked about the front or back door, the fact that she walked out within a minute or two of the call without hesitation, suggests she saw nothing about that meeting that called for caution. The morning of September 13th, 2021, split the Short family's life into before and after. McKeesport police and paramedics arrived at the address on 25th Street shortly after the neighbor found the body in the yard. From that moment on, this stopped being a private matter between two people who'd met in an alley at night and became a case for Allegheny County Police, who now had to determine who had come to see Karli that night and why. The family's response came quickly. A few days after Karli's death, a memorial service was held at Rensiehausen Park in McKeesport, drawing friends, relatives, and neighbors. The service wasn't just about remembering Karli, her smile, the way she looked out for other people. It also included direct appeals to the community for help with the investigation. Karli's aunt told the crowd that this time, Jabdasian so Shai wa Maori Kovisam tragedy had touched their family and their street, but next time it could hit any house, and that if someone knew something, they needed to say it out loud. McKeesport's mayor, who attended the service, echoed the same point. Without the community's help, crimes like this one tend to go unsolved.
How many crimes would be solved and cases closed and justice being served?
Brandon Short, still reeling from the loss himself, started acting almost immediately. He put up 3 billboards around McKeesport, asking for help with the investigation. His daughter's face turned toward everyone who drove or walked past.
Was moved by her story, are now offering $20,000 for information that leads to an arrest.
The family offered a $20,000 reward for information leading to an arrest. Half of that came from the family itself, and it was matched by Richard Basie, a local entrepreneur from the Mon Valley. A company called Pure Pen kicked in another $1,000 to cover flyers and billboard costs. Allegheny County Police set up an anonymous tip line so residents could share information without giving their names. Speaking to the community, Brandon Short said he wouldn't stop until he found whoever took his daughter's life, and that anyone protecting someone else's secret needed to understand. Eventually, that secret would catch up with them. For a man whose public career had been built around performing in front of stadium crowds, this was an entirely new kind of role. A father standing in front of cameras not to talk about football, but to beg for help finding whoever murdered his child. While the family worked to mobilize the town, investigators were quietly doing work that wasn't visible from the outside. Police obtained court orders for detailed phone records and pulled forensic data from cell phones they'd gained access to. That routine, unglamorous work, not the public appeals, is what would eventually crack the case open. Getting court orders for cell carrier billing records, along with permission to pull data off phones, isn't a fast process. It takes time to file, time for carriers to comply, and time for detectives to manually cross-reference numbers, call times, and the cell towers those calls pinged off of. While Karli's relatives were putting up flyers and fielding calls on the tip line, hoping a neighbor would remember something useful, investigators were already sitting on the first technical evidence pointing to a second, hidden phone number in Smith's life. Though at that stage, it still wasn't tied directly to his name. Later that same day, September 13th, something unexpected happened. Isaac Smith walked into Allegheny County Police Headquarters in Greentree entirely on his own. The man who, investigators would later determine, Bertoban says that the Vandis attorney had called Karli from a burner phone just minutes before the shot was fired, showed up voluntarily, with no summons and no lawyer, and spent 3 hours with detectives. During that conversation, Smith didn't deny knowing Karli well. He confirmed they'd been intimate, that he knew about her pregnancy, and said he was willing to be part of the child's life if a DNA test confirmed he was the father. He let police copy the contents of his phone, his regular phone, not the burner, and handed over the identification number for his Dodge pickup.
Involuntarily the day after Karli's death to provide information to detectives, including the number of firearms he owned.
On his way out, he asked investigators to let Karli's family know that he'd cooperated and told them everything he knew. At the time, that behavior, the openness, the willingness to cooperate, the total lack of avoidance with police, worked in his favor. Giving that much information voluntarily doesn't typically match the behavior of someone hiding involvement in a murder. Investigators took his account seriously and weren't in a hurry to treat him as their primary suspect. It's worth asking the obvious question: why would someone who just committed a murder walk into a police station on their own and voluntarily hand over their phone for examination? One possible answer is that openness itself was the strategy. That calm, confident cooperation reads as more convincing than anything he could have said. Another possibility is that it was an attempt to manage the investigation from the inside, to know what police knew instead of waiting for them to come to him. Neither theory can be confirmed with documentation. Both remain speculation, but both fit the profile of someone used to running multiple parallel storylines without losing control of any of them. As the investigation moved forward, though, the picture started to shift, and shift noticeably. A review of Smith's phone records showed that roughly 6 weeks before the murder, he'd bought a Smith & Wesson revolver. 2 weeks after Karli was killed, that same revolver turned up in a pawn shop. Smith had pawned it himself. Ballistics testing would later confirm the bullet pulled from Karli's body had come from that exact gun. The timing of that purchase matters on its own. 6 weeks isn't the timeline of an impulsive decision made in a moment of panic during an argument. It's enough time to choose a weapon, complete the purchase, and keep it ready without tipping off anyone around him. That revolver entered Smith's life well before his girlfriend ever met his parents, and well before his final messages with Karli about the gender reveal party. At the same time, investigators discovered that alongside the regular phone he'd voluntarily handed over, Smith had a second device, the same burner phone used exclusively to contact Karli and nothing else. That was the phone used to make the final call to her number the night of the murder. Smith never mentioned that second phone to investigators, even though he had every opportunity to bring it up during his interview, assuming he actually intended to tell them everything he knew. Surveillance footage from around Furnace Alley captured one more detail: a figure walking toward the spot where Karli was shot, and then retracing the same path away from it. The footage wasn't clear enough to identify the person by appearance. One more piece of the puzzle came from Smith's longtime girlfriend, who spoke to investigators. According to her, on the evening of September 12th, around 11 p.m., Smith left her house in McKeesport, telling her he was going to look at a puppy at a friend's place in Homestead. Around midnight, she said, he texted her. That story about the puppy is essentially the only explanation Smith ever offered for his whereabouts during the window that lined up with Karli's murder. And his girlfriend had no way of confirming where he actually was after he left her place. For those 2 months, from mid-September, when the body was found, to early November, when the first charges were filed, the town lived in a state of uncertainty. By every outward sign, the killer was still close by. There was no evidence he'd left town, and nothing pointed to a random attacker passing through. Local media in those weeks was writing openly about an unidentified killer still walking the streets of McKeesport, while the family and police kept searching, with no idea that the man investigators had already spoken to face-to-face was the very person they were looking for. What ultimately identified Smith as a suspect wasn't so much evidence analysis as a different kind of coincidence. One of the Allegheny County detectives personally recognized his face, having seen him at his workplace, reportedly a bank where he worked. Karli's relatives and loved ones knew their future son-in-law only by name. None of the family had ever met him in person, and until the investigation, none of them could say anything about him beyond his name and a vague idea of where he worked. Piecing together the timing of the burner phone call, the purchase and later pawning of the murder weapon, and the results of the ballistics testing, investigators concluded that the man who'd sat calmly in their office for 3 hours, voluntarily, and asked them to tell his family he'd cooperated, was the very person they'd been looking for from the start.
A man accused of killing a young woman and her unborn baby pleaded not guilty today.
In November 2021, Sisasonle Ponde Pous Momi Twami Fwemi, Isaac Christopher Smith was charged with criminal homicide and criminal homicide of an unborn child. 2 separate counts reflecting the fact that 2 lives were lost on Furnace Alley that night, not one. For the Short family, the arrest wasn't a moment of relief in any ordinary sense. A name that had been a mystery to them for 2 months now had a face. the face of a man none of them had even known existed before the investigation. The billboards Brandon Short had put up around town asking for help had, without anyone realizing it, been speaking to the killer himself the entire time. Almost 5 years passed between the charges being filed in November 2021 and the start of the trial. A gap that long between arrest and trial isn't unusual for a first-degree murder case. Pre-trial hearings, defense motions, forensic testing, and jury selection can stretch the wait into years, and Isaac Smith's case was no exception. He remained in custody the entire time, while Karli's family waited for a trial that would finally answer, officially, whether he was guilty. The trial began May 19, 2026, in a courtroom in downtown Pittsburgh, presided over by Allegheny County Judge Kevin Sasinowski. It was expected to run about 2 weeks and ultimately took 8 days of testimony. Prosecutors had initially sought the death penalty against Smith, but roughly a year before the trial began, the district attorney's office took that off the table, leaving life in prison as the maximum possible sentence. Within the first few days of the trial, jurors learned something that upended the entire premise of the case. DNA lab results, completed shortly before the trial began, showed that Isaac Smith was not the biological father of the child Karli had been carrying.
It was initially believed that Smith was the father to Short's unborn baby, but DNA evidence uncovered during the trial proved that was not the case.
That detail came out early, before jurors had even heard the full details of the crime itself. And from that point on, the entire trial revolved around a paradox. A man on trial for a murder that prosecutors said was committed to protect a secret about fatherhood that, in reality, didn't exist. That fact changes the whole nature of the case. If the prosecution's version is accurate, Smith killed Karli out of fear that the truth about her pregnancy would destroy his life. But the truth he feared literally didn't exist. He acted not on reality, but on his own conviction, which turned out to be wrong. In the early days of testimony, several witnesses took the stand. The woman who called 911 after finding the body, the Allegheny County medical examiner who walked jurors through the bullet's entry point, and a retired county police detective who'd worked the initial scene. That detective gave jurors a detail that had never been made public before. At the time of her death, Karli had been clutching her own phone in her pocket. Jurors were also shown autopsy photos and crime scene images. In his opening statement, Deputy District Attorney Ryan Kyrie built the case around 3 pillars. First, the burner phone, registered under a fake name, used to make the final call to Karli's number just minutes before the shot. Second, the revolver, purchased 6 weeks before the murder and pawned 2 weeks after it, which ballistics testing tied directly to the killing. Third, motive. Smith's fear that his double life would be exposed at the exact moment his longtime girlfriend was meeting his parents. Kyrie summed up the prosecution's logic in a single line. Smith didn't want the double life he was living to be exposed. According to prosecutors, that fear was directly behind the decision he made on the night of September 13th. On the paradox of the DNA results, Kyrie was blunt with the jury. At the moment the defendant pulled the trigger, he didn't have those test results in hand. Karli was ready to publicly name him as the father of her baby, and according to the prosecutor, from where Smith stood, the walls were closing in. A significant portion of the trial focused on testimony from a ballistics expert who presented jurors with findings on the match between the bullet pulled from Karli's body and the revolver recovered from the pawn shop. That kind of analysis compares microscopic markings on a bullet, the scratches and grooves left by a specific gun's barrel, against test rounds fired from the recovered weapon under lab conditions. A match like that leaves very little room for doubt about which weapon fired the fatal shot. During the trial, prosecutors played the recorded interview Smith gave investigators the day Karli's body was found. The same 3-hour voluntary interview in which he repeatedly denied any involvement. On the recording, he told investigators he'd heard a lot of rumors about the case, and according to him, none of them were close to the truth. Detective Mark Ristori, one of the officers who'd conducted that first interview with Smith back in 2021, also testified. Asked by the prosecution about his initial impression of the suspect, he admitted that at the time, investigators had been completely convinced he was telling the truth. Pressed by the prosecutor on whether he meant that literally, the detective confirmed it. That same detective also told the court about a weak point in the evidence. Automated license plate readers hadn't picked up Smith's pickup truck anywhere near the shooting that night, a gap the defense seized on immediately. Smith's defense was led by attorney Thomas Farrell, alongside co-counsel Lizel Weaver. Their case rested on several arguments at once. First, according to Farrell, his client had used contraception with Karli and never considered himself the father of her child, meaning, by the defense's logic, he simply didn't have the motive the entire prosecution case was built on. Second, the defense reminded jurors that Smith himself had been adopted, framing that as evidence that he, of all people, valued human life, including the lives of children not yet born. Third, Farrell leaned heavily on the missing license plate data, the lack of any clearly identifiable face on the surveillance footage of the fleeing figure, and the overall gaps in the direct evidence. Finally, Farrell reminded the jury that in every conversation with police, in 2021 and afterward, Smith had said the same thing every time: he didn't do it. The defense's argument that Smith didn't consider himself the father and therefore had no motive runs directly into conflict with what's known about his own behavior while Karli was alive. He went with her to a prenatal appointment and stayed in contact with her right up until the day she died, discussing details of the upcoming party where he was set to appear publicly as the acknowledged father-to-be. Reconciling a man convinced he had nothing to do with the pregnancy with a man willing to publicly play that exact role was left for the jury to work out on their own. The prosecution and defense offered two completely incompatible readings of the same set of facts. On May 29, 2026, the jury reached a verdict. After deliberating for about 90 minutes, they found Smith guilty on both first-degree counts, the murder of Karli Short and the murder of her unborn child. First Assistant District Attorney Rebecca Spangler said after the verdict that the prosecution was grateful to have secured some measure of justice for Karli and her entire family. On June 3, 2026, Judge Kevin Sasinowski handed down the sentence: 2 life terms to be served consecutively, one after the other, with no possibility of parole. The fact that the 2 sentences were ordered consecutively rather than concurrently reflects exactly what Smith was actually convicted of. Not 1 murder, but 2, the murder of a woman and the murder of her unborn child, each treated under the law as a separate crime requiring its own punishment. At the sentencing hearing, Smith declined to make a statement. On the advice of his own attorneys, he chose not to address the courtroom. The same man who'd once spent 3 hours voluntarily explaining to investigators why he wasn't involved chose silence when it came time to face the consequences for good. His defense, for its part, had already stated its intention to appeal the verdict to a higher court. Today, Isaac Smith is serving his sentence in a Pennsylvania state prison. The appeal his defense said it intended to file has not yet been resolved. As far as available information shows, the appeals process for a case of this scale can take years, and Karli's family may find themselves returning to this story again and again in appellate courtrooms. Given Smith's age at sentencing, even the worst case outcome for him on appeal means he'll spend not just decades, but effectively the rest of his life behind bars with no real prospect of release. At the sentencing hearing, for the first time in the entire process, words were directed not at the jury or the judge, but at Smith himself and at Karli's memory. Brandon Short, addressing the courtroom, refused to say the convicted man's name out loud. He called him only a cowardly killer.
Statements this morning. Karli's father, Brandon Short, refusing to call the suspect by his name, even look in his direction, only referring to him.
He said he was grateful, at least, that his granddaughter hadn't been murdered by her own father. Her real father hadn't killed her. Krista Pettis, Karli's biological mother, spoke to Smith directly. She told him that Karli had been her entire world, that her daughter loved life and wanted only one thing: to become a mother, and that he'd robbed her of the chance to see that happen. She said she had nothing left to look forward to because of him. Karli's stepmother, Martha Short, told the court she'd met her stepdaughter when Karli was 10 years old and described her as kind and caring, quick to compliment the people around her, and someone who loved cooking for others. She reminded the court that the family had moved back to the United States shortly before the tragedy, specifically to spend more time with Karli, time they'd been counting on. Karli's aunt, Felicia Cook, spoke about an ultrasound photo her niece had once shared with her, calling it Karli's joy, her moment. Asked about having to be in the same room as Smith throughout the trial, she said it was devastating. The reaction outside the courtroom was just as visible. The deaths of a former NFL player's daughter and her unborn child drew attention from outlets well beyond Pennsylvania from the very beginning. CBS News, People, Trib Live, the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, Law and Crime, and a number of other national and regional outlets all covered the story. Interest spiked again around the DNA test revelation. A a story about a man who killed his pregnant girlfriend out of fear of a fatherhood that, in the end, was never real. For McKeesport itself, the small town where this happened, Karli Short's case became one that locals will likely remember long after the national coverage moves on. While the trial was still ongoing, the Short family established a foundation in Karli's memory. The Karli Short Better Tomorrow Foundation was originally created to support students affected by gun violence, starting with Karli's own hometown campus, Penn State Greater Allegheny in McKeesport. Over time, the program expanded to Penn State's flagship campus as well. By the time sentencing came down in June 2026, the foundation had raised more than $1 million, established 7 named scholarship funds, and helped pay for the education of 9 students, 3 of whom have already graduated. On June 12, 2026, just 9 days after Judge Sasinowski handed down the sentence, the foundation held its 5th annual gala at Acrisure Stadium in Pittsburgh, home field of the Pittsburgh Steelers. The closeness of those 2 dates, the killer's sentencing and another charity gala in his victim's honor, says something on its own about how this family chose to deal with the loss, not by withdrawing into grief, but through consistent year-after-year work done in Karli's name. Past galas for the foundation have drawn Brandon Short's old NFL friends, including names like Franco Harris, LeVar Arrington, and Curtis Martin, with past Penn State teammates such as Anthony Adams serving as hosts. For everything the investigation and trial managed to piece together, Karli Short's case still leaves a few questions that the public record doesn't answer. The biggest one involves the real father of her child. The DNA test ruled out Smith, but who the biological father actually was has never been disclosed by investigators or the court, and it's likely to remain a private matter that belongs to Karli's family alone. The second unresolved question is the identity of the person caught on surveillance cameras walking toward and then fleeing the scene of the crime. Despite becoming, in effect, the central piece of evidence in the case, that figure was never identified from the footage itself. Prosecutors built their case not on a direct visual identification, but on a combination of phone records, ballistics, and motive that the jury apparently found convincing enough without one. Those same gaps are almost certainly what the defense's appeal will lean on. The lack of a direct identification of the person on the recording, and the fact that automated license plate readers never picked up Smith's vehicle near the crime scene the night of the murder, both give the defense formal grounds to keep contesting the verdict, even though the combined weight of the other evidence convinced the jury in just 90 minutes of deliberation. Whether that verdict survives the appeals process is a question that this story hasn't answered yet. Karli Short lived 26 years. She had big plans, and she spent her life looking out for other people. She was getting ready to become a mother. Neither she nor her unborn child did anything that could explain, let alone justify, what happened to them. Can someone commit murder out of fear of being exposed, even when that fear was never grounded in reality to begin with? Karli Short's case answers that question with a yes, and it leaves behind a harder one for anyone watching. Why do we tend to treat crimes built on false motives as somehow less serious than the irreversible harm they actually cause?